If you somehow couldn't tell, I am a Christian, so I think about theology a lot. And thanks to a comment on my most recent animation, the Nico clones, go watch it if you didn't after you watched this video, it got me thinking about Cat God and his nature as quote-unquote God. Also, I know that this is a very silly topic, but it's fun, and if you like this extremely different topic, then definitely subscribe. Before the video starts, here's an interesting verse from the Bible. 1 John 2:22, "And who is a liar? Anyone who says that Jesus is not the Christ. Anyone who denies the Father and the Son is an Antichrist." Before rereading 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, I always thought of the Antichrist as just the Antichrist, as if there'd be a single guy who would be the Antichrist, the biggest signal of the end times. But in reality, it's simply people who are anti-Christ, people who don't accept God or His Son and their divinity, and people who are hard-hearted and will never even try to understand what God was trying to say. What is God? Before I get into any sort of theory crafting for what Cat God actually is, we have to first establish what he's not and definitions. God is an uncreated being that created everything and has existed for all of eternity. He has no physical features because he's uncreated, but as the creator of everything, he can do anything and control the universe in any way he wishes. Basically, he's a being that's all-powerful and omnipresent, but invisible and incomprehensible to our minds, even as he interacted in the past with our world and how he continues to this day. Cat God can't possibly follow this definition of what God in reality is, and there can only be one supreme being of the universe because, due to the nature of God, there can only be room for one being that controls everything. If there was another that was more powerful, then that being would be God instead, as God cannot be controlled or stopped, as he's above our physical reality itself. Since Cat God is around 20 years old, is a created being, he can't exist during certain times because he was born at some point, and clearly isn't omnipresent while experiencing very human things like napping, missing information, feeling romantic at times, feeling as if his time is being wasted, and all sorts of other things. It's completely nonsensical to believe that within the theology of battle cats that this is actually the divine creator behind everything. Plus, with a similar being existing within Battle Cats, that being the Doge God in the Japanese version of Battle Cats, it adds a whole nother level of confusion to this whole thing, but I don't mention that too often. Theories. With these reasons, it's far more logical to believe that Battle Cats have a more pagan theological structure than you'd think, that Cat God isn't the real God, as there has to be a being above him or possibly other things, though I can still see the theology of this game being monotheistic. I also have to clarify that cats are clearly some kind of chosen people group, because Cat God only cares about them. He doesn't provide blessings for the enemies of the cats as far as we know, unlike the God of the Hebrews, where in Jonah 3, verse 10, it says, "When God saw what they had done and how they had put a stop to their evil ways, he changed his mind and did not carry out the destruction he had threatened." It's specifically talking about when the prophet Jonah went to Nineveh and told them to change their evil ways because God would destroy them. No mercy like this is given to any of the enemies in Battle Cats. Cat God is God. The most straightforward theory about Cat God that I have is that he really is God, and similar to Christianity, he's part of some kind of trinity as a person with a divine nature, and it's something that we see in the game. This can explain his created nature and why he has humanistic desires, though I don't find this outlook on Cat God satisfactory. For one, it's very flawed. In real life, God came down in the form of Jesus to show that he loves us so much that he'd lower himself to a human level and suffer as the lowest kind of person in society, and so he could save us from our sins and fulfill the Old Testament prophecies. But Cat God doesn't do this. There's seemingly just no reason as to why he'd make himself into a human or a created being, since all he does is play video games and hits on his own, big quotation marks, creations like Valkyrie. If this was truly God, he'd have no inclination to flirt with what he already made, and if anything, he could just make himself a wife if he felt as if he wanted one for whatever reason. But he never does this, because of the fact that there's literally no reason for him to do this, and the fact that God does everything for a reason. I don't think this way of thinking makes much sense. And the fact that Cat God feels like fighting you 3 times in Cats of the Cosmos. I mean, why in the world would God fight his own creations for no reason? I guess you could say that he's testing the power of his cat army, but I don't find it likely that he'd be willing to kill thousands of his chosen race for a test. God never kills his own people just because he feels like fighting them, unless he has some kind of affinity for war and wasn't God at all, but I'll get into that later. Cat God is a demon. Here's where we get into more interesting territory. Since I'm using Christianity as a theological base for this, a demon by that metric is simply an angel that followed Satan and decided to rebel against God due to their jealousy towards humanity and God's love towards them. Similarly to God though, demons don't operate under the same rules that we do, as they're fully spirit without physical bodies. What this means is that Cat God had to have been possessed and fully taken over for this outlook on his nature to make sense. And what this implies is that his powers aren't divine or from a holy source, but are simply a counterfeit version of what's holy, as demons can't do miracles and usually appear as if they're divine or angelic, despite the fact that it's all a trick. The implications of this are pretty big, and because of how intelligent demons are, him being able to float, seemingly do miracles, and him having knowledge of not being born yet for stories of legends makes more sense, as demons and likewise angels can't forget anything. Him being a demon can also explain the reason why the cats are fighting endlessly and dying constantly in order to spread their empire to the world tens of times over, as demons are jealous of humans, or cats in this instance, since people have the ability to be forgiven by God and are loved by him. A demon would want to convince you that it's actually God as well. That's most likely why he goes by the name Cat God, and refers to himself consistently as just God. Demons are incredible at lying, so that check out. Plus it also explains the conditional miracles. Why would the actual God need anything from you to do a miracle? Instead, just like a deal, Cat God says that if you give him cat food, then he'll give you one of his holy miracles to help you in battle. You wouldn't expect this from a genuinely all-powerful being that doesn't ever need anything, since he made everything. So he's clearly a demon. He leads the cats to destruction while laying back and enjoying the chaos because of his demonic hatred towards them, and takes deals unlike actually holy entities, right? And he's always trying to hit on girls, which would fit a demon's animalistic nature. Well, while I like this way of seeing Cat God and I find it interesting, it's impossible for it to be true, as demons have the inability to actually heal wounds. The best a demon can do is cut you and then undo it and say, "I healed you." Well, Cat God can use his miracle healing oasis to fully heal your cats to 100% HP. Flat out, it'd be impossible for any demon to do this, so that entirely throws out the Cat God being a demon theory unless the actual God of battle cats gave him the authority to genuinely heal your units. Though this being the case shouldn't even be entertained, as that's never happened before. Outside of this, it's a fun theory, but I personally don't think it can be true. Cat God is an angel. While angels like the Archangel Raphael can heal and can appear physically with a human-like appearance, this can't be possible, as an angel would never claim to be God. Besides, angels usually appear for a very specific reason, that being to deliver some kind of message from the Lord or to protect and help people. But with Cat God's constant claiming to be the actual God and conditional miracles, it makes this one of the weakest possible explanations for what he is in reality. Cat God achieved godhood. Now we're getting weird. Christian beliefs teach that becoming God or God himself is literally impossible and disgustingly heretical. But let's go outside of that and see it in a Mormon way, so this can make more sense. Any Mormons watching, if I'm wrong, certainly correct me. But basically, if you live a great Mormon life, you'll have your own heavenly kingdom and gain all the attributes of God and your own universe. And this sort of thing, according to them, happened exactly to the God of the earth, as they believe at some point he was flesh and blood just like us, just on another planet before us. If Cat God lived a previous life as a great man on a different planet, died, and was granted his own kingdom with a completely different set of goals for what he wanted his creation to do, then that could make a lot of sense. His goal could be completely different from the Earth's God, where instead of making the Earth as a test for all humans to reach godhood, it could simply be to watch animals fight a lot. He could orient the entire world towards this one purpose and kickstart it whenever he wanted to. And it also makes sense for how Cat God wrote that in stories of legends he wouldn't be born yet. According to this though, it conflicts with the initial definition of God being the infinite single creator, as the Mormon view on God logically cuts itself, since there'd be no beginning God of everything ever. Simply, gods are created without a greater cause that started any of that, so it's a bit unsatisfying to me, but weirdly interesting. A second way you could see this is that Cat God somehow obtained godhood early on in life through unknown means, though this conflicts with our definition of God a lot. A created being by the definition of God can never become God, since God is an uncreated, eternal, invisible entity. Our definition of God would have to change radically again to something that has dominion over reality. If we changed it to that, then stories of legend and uncanny legends still can logically happen, because this was just the point before Cat God became Cat God. But that doesn't really make him God, does it? By this definition, he couldn't have created everything, and therefore he's more of a vaguely super being, but not really God. Cat God's just another pagan deity. There are tons of pagan deities in real life for basically anything you can think of. There's a whole Greek and Roman pantheon of gods, Zoroastrian gods, Gnostic gods, or general Satanism with demons like Baphomet. Who's to say that Cat God isn't just another one of these pagan gods? First of all, when a pagan says the word God, they don't think of it in the same way as someone with a normal religion like Judaism, Christianity, or even Islam does. They just see them as super powerful beings that control specific parts of the world, and they're usually created or born. For example, under the Greek pantheon, the god Zeus was a created being, as he was born by Re and the son of Kronos, though he had abilities like being able to shapeshift and the ability to control lightning. Unlike the single god of Christianity though, Zeus just did whatever he wanted for whatever reason, which led him doing immoral things like when he threw his son Hephaestus off of a mountain because he had physical disabilities. And also Zeus's absurdly gross, lustful nature says enough about how bad he was. This is definitely true for all the other gods in pagan beliefs. Basically, they're just terrible, and they usually don't have any moral code while still being created beings. Cat God could fit in perfectly as some kind of pagan war god, and it can explain why you fight him 3 separate times in Cats of the Cosmos. He is the god of the cats, has supernatural abilities, and overall isn't that special in comparison to a few other cat units that could also easily fall under some kind of pagan battle cats pantheon. Though I could see him being worshipped favorably by most cats as he's the god of the cats. Bahamut could be an earlier god before Cat God, as he's described as ancient in his bio, and Bahamut even refers to a being that holds up the entire world or behemoth. Valkyrie could be seen as another god, so could maybe Dogumon and others like the Pixies and Gaia the Creator, who's described as literally the origin of life. The enemies would also have their own gods too if this is how Battlecast theology works, as they have deities like the Doge God and other super beings like Cruel Angel Kleinil and Ensanglion, I think it's Esanglion, correct me in the comments, Esanglion the Calatamy. Through this, Cat God having the personality that he has would make sense. Him wanting cat food from you in exchange for miracles also makes sense, as it'd be like offering a sacrifice. But him being behind things like the enemy descriptions or even screens like when you first start Stories of Legends don't. Even if it seems to be, because he's not omnipresent and he doesn't control everything. There are also still so many other elements of the game that seem to have his touch, but they can't if he's simply another pagan god. To me, this is still the most plausible theory that I've come up with, if we change what God actually is, though it doesn't satisfy the fact that there logically still have to be a being that initially created everything, including units like Gaia that started life as the Battlecats know it. And it can't explain why a lot of descriptions, even the Stories of Legends start screen, are still oozing with his personality. God's spokesperson. God in this universe could have simply created a cat god to be who he speaks and does things through. What this means is that cat god is more like a puppet as opposed to a real, normal being, and each generation could have had a cat god in place as God's spokesperson, as in a person God controls and gives messages through. This would make all or most of cat god's words and actions still God the Father's. And how he talks is how God sees it fit to talk to his own creations, and therefore Cat God's words are directly God's, but he himself, the vessel, isn't God, though God limits his power a little bit when he allows the vessel to do things like hit on Valk. This basically would make him a more extreme version of a prophet, where instead of relaying information God gives so the people who need to hear it, or predicting future events, he instead speaks directly from a created being so that the cats can understand divine knowledge. Him being an extreme prophet also can explain his special abilities and the limits they have, as you can't just ask him to kill the enemies on the map. Though because of the fact that he's still a created being with kind of his own personality still, he'd want something in return for doing you services, this being the cat food. I also assume that with each incarnation, Cat God shows up differently and does what he does differently, but he still retains the same personality. This explains why the Stories of Legends beginning screen clarifies that the Cat God that we know wasn't born yet, while still oozing with his exact personality through this writing. The implications of this are a little confusing. The cat god that we know of under this way of thinking comes from a seemingly eternal line of other beings that God spoke through in order to rule the cats in the physical world, though it still technically allows for cat god to have created everything because he technically isn't any of his created vessels. From this we can understand that cat god existed before cat god in a different way, or that this message from cat god was from God the Father, the uncreated being that controls cat god and every vessel before him, or a previous vessel of cat god actually wrote the stories of legends and uncanny legend screens while still knowing of our cat god's existence due to the prophetic abilities. We also see that cat god to some extent is omnipresent, which is one of God's most defining features, so there has to be clear separation between the personhood of cat god and God the Father. It also explains unit descriptions like Valkyrie's, where it's described that cat god hits on her, and knowing cat god's personality, this wouldn't make sense for him to write because it's embarrassing and he's self-centered, unless there was a being above him that controls him in at least some limited sense. It also can explain every single enemy and unit description, as each and every one is either a little snarky or serious in an explanation of how cool the unit is. Though this seems like a pretty solid theory, it still doesn't explain why he fights you in Cats of the Cosmos, because again, why would a prophet fight against his chosen people? And it has some of the least proof out of each of these theories. We never see another being like Cat God, unlike how we see other deities if we were to assume that he was just another pagan god. And the unique issue of his age only becomes a factor with this theory as well. Into the Future happens at least 900 years after the Empire of Cats, where Cat God said to only be 20. If this was God's spokesperson, then we can only assume that he was able to have a far longer lifespan thanks to God the Father's divine abilities, or that these continual spokespersons from generation to generation appear as the same exact identical being. But that can't be, because stories of legends takes place before Cat God was born and he's not there. So we can't assume that he always appears in the same way. Or we can just fully rule out this theory. Cat God's an alien. Though Into the Future implies that Cat God is an alien, I don't like this simple explanation, and it doesn't explain a lot of other things. First of all, we don't even know for sure if it's Cat God who writes these intros himself. We only assume it's him because of the way they're written, as they have the aura of his personality. And secondly, Cat God in Cats of the Cosmos never comes as an enemy with alien typing. His first appearance as an enemy is traitless, his second is floating, and his third is traitless. If he was truly an alien, then why doesn't he have this typing? Instead, what can be assumed from the beginning of Into the Future's text is that an alien is the writer of all story texts, and this can explain how they know that Cat God wasn't born yet in SOL, for clearly limited memory and casual everyday activities. God simply 20. This theory assumes that Cat God is the one true God, but he's a created being that's only existed for 20 years, and through his existence he created everything in an instant, including past and present events. What this means is that effectively, many things could have happened in the ancient past that Cat God knows about due to his nature as God, despite the fact that technically everything that exists, be that past or present, is around his age or younger, even if beings in the universe don't see it as that way and can have memories that date back to any amount of years in the past. This means that even though he is a created being, there existed a timeline before him because he recreated time through his incarnation. This also implies that everything that happened in Battle Cats is a predestined event, as everything before Cat God had to happen perfectly placed so that he would have existed in the first place, similar to how Islam sees their God and predestination, as to them Allah already planned everything, though this raises a few moral issues, like how Cat God knowingly and technically forcefully sent millions and millions of cats and other animals to their deaths for seemingly no reason. I see that this is an actually plausible theory given his nature and an explanation for how he's 20, though this would still make him a created being that was born at some point before he presumably rewrote the previous existence and timeline in which he was born. This is the most interesting theory for Cat God, and kind of implies that within the verse there can just be beings that are born that reset the entire universe whenever to bring them to certain points in time. This would explain everything, including Cat God fighting for your units even though he'd know and plan out his own loss before it even happened, and due to the moral bankruptcy an all-powerful entity must have to specifically plan out, honestly, probably billions of deaths. It's not shocking that he'd fight your cats. We literally can't know. Here's more of a sort of atheist perspective on this whole thing. This theory assumes that we simply just don't know what Cat God is, and can never know due to plenty of reasons. For one, we can't be fully sure that Cat God created any units in the first place or wrote anything when it comes to their details. If we take the fact that an alien is writing the intro to Into the Future, we can also be sure in assuming that nothing Cat God seemingly wrote was actually written by him. These story accounts, be they Into the Future, Empire of Cats, Cats of the Cosmos, Stories and Legends, are clearly not from within the cat army's perspective. It's an outside either enemy or neutral perspective that's not always the same. A human probably wouldn't mention cat god in the writings of Stories of Legends intro, and into the future, the writer says they're action alien from space, not an all-powerful deity. All we know that cat god can do is provide 4 different miracles and push back enemies once we unlock them as a unit. But all of this comes at an exchange. We have to give him cat food for a miracle, we have to beat him twice in Castle of the Cosmos to get him as a unit, and we have to spend XP upgrading him. You wouldn't expect that from an all-powerful entity, as in the need for something to do something else. If Cat God really is who he says he is, then why doesn't he perform miracles regularly or occasionally without pay? Through this reasoning, we can assume that Cat God isn't all-powerful. Similarly though, to real life, this answer is immensely unsatisfying and rather dull, and it feels wrong. We don't know as opposed to he's not or he is feels extremely weak, especially as a theory, which is part of why I don't rock with it. So what is Cat God? Personally, out of each of these theories that I thought of and poked a few holes through, I think the pagan deity or the cat god's actually 20 theories make the most sense. Cat God can't be a demon because demons can't heal. He can't be an angel as an angel's a demon if they claim to be God. He couldn't have achieved godhood because our main definition of God and the fact that he'd be more of a super being. And even though him being God's spokesperson would make a lot of sense given enemy descriptions and how a lot of things battle cats are written, there's also nothing that we have that can show the past vessels for Cat God. Though him being pagan God and him being actually 20 years old fights back pretty hard on what God actually is in real life, I think that these two possibilities make the most sense due to his personality, nature, and abilities. Before the video closes out, here's a powerful and divisive verse from the Bible. Jude 1:10. But these people scoff at things they do not understand. Like unthinking animals, they do whatever their instincts tell them, and so they bring about their own destruction. We have to remember that we as humans always have flawed ideas, and we can't just act however we feel. Jude describes people who find it silly to listen to anything or anyone but themselves. And through that, there's only 2 bad endpoints: sin and death. It might sound obvious to some, and others may feel called out by it, but the truth within this verse should mean a lot to everyone. I hope you all enjoyed this video. Leave a like, subscribe, and also comment down below on what you think Cat God really is. I believe he's just another pagan god, but hey, maybe you all have completely different thought processes from me. Have a good day everyone, and goodbye.